Hello, I'm going to briefly go over some information from Lecture 6, Groups, Organizations, and Bureaucracies, or some combination of that. And I'm going to share the screen so you may see the same presentation, basically, that you will find in the PDF that's already posted. You should already have seen the questions, the question pool from which I will draw the information you need to know to answer the questions that will be drawn from lecture 6. So let us move along. First, I share the screen. All right. You should see former dictator, leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, the head of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the name Stakhanov, who was a hero of Soviet labor. He mined 6 tons of coal, I believe, in a shift. That's mining by hand with this little thing, knocking it out of a coal seam, getting it into a cart. He set records, others beat his records, but there are statues of Stakhanov all over the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union still. Everyone was urged to work hard like him, build socialism. Here we have a place where a lot of people are working very hard and are monitored by a lot of high-tech devices to keep them working and keep track of their location and make sure they're going to the closest bathroom and not wasting any time that could be spent to making Jeff Bezos perhaps the world's first trillionaire eventually. This is the former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton. I can't recall his name right now. I just know the photo is of that. What do they have in common? Well, I don't know. You can decide. What is a group? Okay, so we're moving beyond individual interaction and getting up into the groups that we are members of, in which these interactions occur. Now, what's been happening here kind of as we're building to crescendo of sorts, very anticlimactic crescendo perhaps. We've talked about what sociology is and some of the theories that sociologists apply to understanding the social world. We talked about the research methods that sociologists use to test their theories or test beliefs which are deduced from those theories. Finally, then we talked about culture, the basic elements of our life, really. What we bring to social behavior from smaller groups. Now we're moving towards groups as a whole, and then in this lecture, well, I skipped over interaction. We covered interaction and socialization, how we come to understand how it is we're supposed to behave and what to expect of others. And what is the nature of interaction with others? Most of this interaction takes place in groups because it tends to involve 2 people at least. So these are groups of various sizes. In this lecture, we're going to move all the way up to the entire society. And then in the remainder of the class, we're going to talk about more specific parts of our social world and aspects therein. So the first half of the class up through this is really getting the basic concepts and the tools we'll use to understand social class, race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality as all 3 dimensions of inequality. Understand changes in work and the economy, politics and government, deviance, crime, population, urbanization, and the environment. That's going to take up the last part of the class. So more or less halfway through when I finish this lecture, but in terms of time, we're not quite halfway through the 10-week term. In fact, this is really the end of the 2nd week. So, all right, a group. define in our free textbook: collection of at least two people who interact with some frequency and who share some sense of aligned identity. That means they believe they're part of this, of a particular entity called a group. It could be a club, it could be a club of some sort, it could be a religious congregation, it could be a group that is a work team. You have a sense of aligned identity. You all believe you are part of the same thing. Some of the terms sociologists have used to explore the nature of group interaction: primary groups. These are small, typically informally arranged groups of people that are closest to us. These would be our parents, our closest friends, for instance. Secondary groups are larger groups that's more impersonal. Usually the students in a class are a secondary group. They are task focused and time limited. The task is to deal with a certain body of knowledge, a certain amount of it, certain field of study, or acquire a certain quantity of information to be applied later. And they're time limited. It lasts a semester and only at specific times during the week. So a dyad is a group composed of two people. A triad includes three people. These are, I believe, from Greek: di for two and tri for three. For instance, a triangle, three angles. Can't think of something that begins with di now. Bi, I believe, is the Latinized version. But there are a number of words that begin with dy that aren't a group of, don't have anything to do with two. So anyway, we'll move on. Some other kinds of groups, which you can probably grasp pretty readily. The in-group. So when you belong to, you feel it's part of your identity. The out-group is a group that you're not a part of. You may even be competing with the out-group. These could, in high school, cliques, for instance. If you're in a clique, that's an in-group. The out-group is everyone else. If you're not a member of the clique, you would say they consider themselves the in-group, but they're not. So reference groups is the group to which you compare yourself to. It could actually be an individual. It doesn't have to be a group. It could be a famous person, or it could be completely fictional. Not so long ago, people might have identified with Harry Potter characters. I wanted to be Harry Potter. When I was 7 or 8 or 9, I identified with a character on a television show, Lost in Space. I wanted to be like this person. I had dreams about having play dates with this person. That's, neither here nor there, but as we get older, there may be someone who's a model for us, we want to live our life as they did. That would be the reference group of person. So I'm perhaps assuming that it can be a person and not an entire group, but usually that person represents a way of being, per se, that a number of people might choose. So, okay, if you're in a group, you're a member of a group, there's pressure on you to conform to the norms, the ideas, the expectations of the other members of the group. You need to think like they think. Conformity is just that. It's accepting other attitudes, beliefs, norms, simply because you want to fit in with the others. You're conforming. Take a look at this video, the Asch conformity experiment. It is mentioned in a film, Experimenter, which I would ordinarily show my class, but I cannot. I'm not allowed to show it in this on distance education, but you can watch this YouTube experiment about the Asch conformity experiment. What happens there is the subject of the experiment is a person who is a single individual. He's sitting with a group of other people who are in on the experiment. They know they're part of the experimental modification of the situation. The experimenter properly will show them an image of a group of lines of different lengths, or maybe they're the same length. And they'll all be labeled. He will ask each member of the group which one is the longest or which one is the shortest. And in the beginning, they all pick what they actually see. But then, as part of the experiment, they pick the wrong one. And then they get to the person who is the subject of the experiment. Let's see if he conforms. Does he choose the wrong one, even though his own eyes tell him it's wrong? Well, generally, yes. They will say the shortest one is the longest one if the other people have said it. They found that if you had a confederate, if one member of the group disagrees with everyone else and then you get to the subject is more likely to go with what is actually the case because somebody else is there to support him. Someone else sees it the way, so feels more courage. So then finally, a network is a group of sorts, but it's more of a description of group arrangements and structures, direct and indirect connections that a person has to other people or groups. So social networks, they involve connections to others. Mostly, I would guess, people you had never met and will never meet in person. You can, if you choose, limit it to people you actually know, but it's an interesting experiment to look through all your contacts and see what percentage of them are people you actually know. So social networks can be important. I mean, knowing others and other fields of work may help you find something in that area if you decide you want to do that sort of work. In '73, I believe he was a mathematician or economist, perhaps Mark Granovetter, published a paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, and showed that the networks are held together by weak ties, really, between people who may not actually know one another and may have significant differences. So these kind of networks, this is pre-Facebook, Twitter, all that. So this would have just been asking people who their closest associates are, who they know, and so forth, and then making connections between those. And he really developed this idea mathematically. So, okay, what he found was that people with a lot of weak ties, a connection to someone they don't know very well, it's not a direct connection, that's a strong tie, they really have more social power and potential than those with a lot of close, strong ties, just one-on-one people, a direct connection. Why is that? Well, the people you have direct connection to may be a lot like you. If you're an accountant, mostly you know accountants, okay? But let's say you want to become a music promoter, something like promote concerts in clubs. You ask your accountant friends how to do that. They may not know, but one of them may know someone. You don't know. They may know someone they can put you in touch with who can talk to you about it. So that's how weak ties can give you something that these direct ties do not. Here's some more information about social networks if you are interested. Networks these would be considered nodes, and this high with varying degrees of centrality. See, this person knows all of these people, whereas here's a low centrality. Well, I'm not going to go into that. We're getting it. Organizations. Okay. First off, let's talk about what a community is for sociologists. Community is simply a group of people that agrees on something, a belief, religious beliefs, or values of some sort, or politics, or other norms that other groups do not. So good examples are religious denominations, subcultures, something that they have in common, a community. An organization, which is Max Weber spent a lot of time writing about organizations. They are communities that exist for a specific purpose. They are there to get something done. Could be a business, could be a voluntary organization like a political lobby group. These examples, these subtypes you don't need to know, but organizations have functions. They're intended to do something. Some of those functions are manifest, if you remember the theory of functionalism. They're obvious. Some are latent. For instance, look at Houston Community College. That's an organization. Its manifest function is to give students education in certain fields, provide information that may be useful to them in some way for personal reasons in the job market, whatever it may be, you know, get through some courses to transfer and then, you know, study more advanced topics. There's also latent functions like it gives people like me part-time jobs. It gives full-time jobs to librarians, to janitors, to functionaries in the registrar's office. That's not why the college exists. Sometimes people lose sight of that. That's not uncommon. You have something called the bureaucratic personality I'll mention, but Weber wrote a lot about bureaucracies. Bureaucracy he considered an ideal type. Remember, an ideal type is something, some entity. It's a list of features that an entity they're applied to might have. It doesn't have to have all of them. So it's not really like a definition, which is more explicit. So we'll get to what some of the features of this ideal type. But bureaucracies are formal organizations, meaning they have a structure, they have rules that are designed to be more rational and efficient than other organizations. Well, you probably think of bureaucracy as something that gets in the way of things, throws up something called red tape, hoops one has to jump through, things you have to do before you can get to the real reason you are accomplishing, finding what it is you really want. You have to fill out forms, you have to register, sign up on a website or something like that. You know, you want to order a hamburger to be delivered, but you're forced to create an account. They don't give you a guest account option. This is somewhat bureaucratic, but they make you do that because it could be more efficient. You might not have to keep re-entering the same information. So that's an organizational aspect of a website for a restaurant or something. So Weber thought they were efficient and were necessary in advanced society because bureaucracies provide standard operating procedures so that an employee in a bureaucracy doesn't have to look at each case individually. You just categorize that case, ask a few questions, and look in the rule manual or the procedure, and you'll find the answer. If you've ever dealt with a call center to deal with your cable or your internet or a computer that's not working, you know what that's about. People they have a script. You respond. You may punch some numbers on your phone, and that is answering a certain number of questions to get you to somebody who will read the right script to you, and that is the procedure. It is standardized. If that person lost their job, someone else would come in and be just reading the same script. So rational, Weber's terms, that's something called instrumental rationality, means finding the most efficient, meaning the cheapest and fastest means, the way to do it, to a particular end, which is a goal. That's his view of rationality in this context. There were other kinds of rationality he wrote about. So these features I'm going to mention, and with all ideal types, are somewhat exaggerated features. They don't exist in exactly the same format in everything which he might call a bureaucracy. But for Weber, bureaucracy was a reflective and perhaps the best reflection of this process of rationalization, which he saw as proceeding throughout history. Rationalization of the social world and The fully fledged bureaucracy for Weber is when we entered the era of modernity, when you began to see those organizations developed in the world for various purposes. Although there were organizations which did one or two of the things that modern bureaucracies do, but they were quite a bit different in one way or another. So you've seen the study guide with the questions. You know what the question is going to be like. You're going to see a list of features of the bureaucracy, and one of them will not be something from this list. So you need to learn what's on the list. I've had to do it over and over. It shouldn't be too hard. Bureaucracies have a lot of offices, departments, for instance, and they have different things to do. At HCC, we got the registrar's office, which keeps records, the admissions office, there's the financial office where you pay your fees. There's the library, that is a specific office. They do what they do. Each department of instruction has a specific chain of command, different people in charge, and they're responsible for different courses. And there's a hierarchical organization. There's somebody at the top that is responsible ultimately for everything that happens and can give instructions to people beneath them in this pyramidal power structure. So our chancellor, Dr. Maldonado, he actually reports to the board of trustees, which are elected officials. It's a public bureaucracy. It's supported by public funds. So there's a board of trustees to make sure one person does not have all the power and does not do anything unseemly. Okay. Pardon me. To get a job in one of these offices, there's a job description with requirements that you have to meet to be hired. This prevents somebody hiring their friends, or prevents situation in the pre-bureaucratic world where you might purchase the office. This happened a lot in the Catholic Church and in political organizations. You could purchase a job. Sometimes if you purchase the job, it was your property and you could leave it to your son or daughter, so they would get the job when you were done with it. In medieval France, before the French Revolution, you had something called tax farmers. These were the tax collectors that would collect taxes for the king. Typically, these were friends of the king, other aristocrats perhaps, or someone that had done a favor for the king. They were given the right to collect taxes in a particular area, and there were all manner of bizarre taxes. The upper classes were exempt from all taxes, so they had to squeeze it all out of the poor. And they weren't paid a salary. They basically were told, you are to collect this much money and bring it back to me. Well, so they would collect more. Whatever they could get beyond that, that was their pay. They might work from their own home, however defined. They might, hire a few people to put pressure on those that didn't want to pay up with the taxes when they showed up at the door. So, person earns a fixed salary in a bureaucracy in general. There might be bonuses, it's different, but anyway. And they provide all the tools. You don't have to provide your own tools. The French tax farmer had to ride his own horse and have his own strong box for the money that was collected and so forth. But in a bureaucracy, they own the computers, they own the desk, they give you the paper. You don't provide your own tools. Okay. And that office, that position doesn't belong to you. It's not your property. You can't leave it to a child. Also, they document everything. Everything that happens is written down somehow. It's recorded, and it's kept in a file indefinitely, usually, although many bureaucracies have a retention policy, and after that it goes to off-site storage. And emails in particular these days, many organizations want them deleted after a certain length of time, particularly if it's a public organization, because there's something called the Freedom of Information Act, or at the federal level, and there's the act in Texas is, I think, called the Texas Public Information Act. You can make a formal request to an organization for all the records they have on a particular topic. So if they've destroyed them, obviously they don't have to give them to you, they don't exist. If they do have an embarrassing email and it's scooped up in a request, then that could be embarrassing for the powers that be. So they, typically emails are deleted after a certain length of time. Any notes, for instance, that a field investigator in Harris County Pollution Control takes while investigating an environmental crime, they may or may not just be shredded at the end of the day. They're supposed to be entered into a database, and the original notes are shredded so that they don't have to provide those. All right. Organization charts were considered a great innovation in understanding organizations that you worked in or just in general. A man named Farol in France in the early part of the 20th century pushed these and people adopted them. Here's one for an organization I used to work for, the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, otherwise known as the Crime Lab. It doesn't even get down to the job I had. See, there are some names here because there were people appointed at the time and they needed to identify them. Typically, an org chart will identify the names of the incumbents. But as you see at the top, they report ultimately to the commissioner's court, the county commissioners. It's that group of 4 commissioners plus the county judge that makes all decisions for the county. They hire the chief medical examiner, who hires other people to work under them, who hires the other people, et cetera, et cetera. So as I said, Weber is kind of, there's the modernization and rationalization of the world and the spread of bureaucracy they're really the same thing for him. That's what's driving history, the increasing bureaucratization and rationalization. Marx, of course, thought class conflict was driving it. Capitalists always maintain some control. One reason that Weber thought you had to have bureaucracies because it was so complex. You could not actually evaluate each problem on a case-by-case basis. You had to have general rules that allowed people to make decisions and get it done quickly. Bureaucracies have changed somewhat, quite a bit in the last few years, organizations in general. Many of them have adopted things like just-in-time production, whereas in the 50s and early 60s, a company that made, say, bed springs, they would hire a lot of people to make bed springs and they'd fill up a warehouse. They would hire a sales force to go out and sell these things to those that needed springs. They would have their own payroll department for keeping track of wages and preparing checks, and an accounting department for other high-level stuff, a personnel department for hiring people, firing people, disciplining people. You began to see this being outsourced in terms of labor. You had temporary agencies, temps, which is contingent labor. Contingent means maybe yes, maybe no. In other words, maybe we have work for you, maybe not, maybe so. But you would be hired temporarily. You wouldn't have the benefits that full-time employees of that company might have had. So they could get by with fewer permanent employees with benefits. They could outsource their payroll to companies. They could outsource human resources, all these things. There were companies that were out there advertising themselves as being ready to do this for a variety of companies. You could subcontract just about anything. Most call centers for cable companies, for computers, they're overseas because labor is cheaper. And we're all connected by the internet. Even some prison labor has been used for some of these things that companies used to do for themselves. Oh, anyway, I was saying, you're filling the warehouse with springs and you just keep doing that. Maybe you've got people who belong to a union in the factory making them. If suddenly there's an economic downturn, you're not selling as many springs, you lay off your staff, and after you've run out of springs, after you get low, because they're still selling, you start calling people back to the same jobs they drew unemployment or something while they were waiting. So you don't see that quite as much anymore. Now, you also have something called just-in-time production, where you only produce those things you have orders for. This was always very common in some industries, like the apparel industry, clothing, especially if you're talking about clothing with fashions that change. I worked in that field. I'm sure you can tell that I have quite a background in high fashion, but truly I did. I was a go-between between the sales force and the design force. So I worked in women's clothing for about 5 years. McDonaldization and bureaucracy. It's really much the same. Ritzer's ideas of McDonaldization are just really an application of Weber's ideas about rationalization and bureaucracy. So sociologists pretty quickly realized that, maybe their bureaucracies are rational to a certain extent, but there's a lot that is irrational about them. Red tape is one I mentioned. Too many things to have to do before you can get to the matter at hand. Hoops to jump through. Catch-22s are common. That comes from the name of a book written by Joseph Heller, who was a bomber pilot in the Second World War. There was also a film starring Alan Arkin you may find here and there on Netflix or Amazon. Catch-22, about Yossarian and his attempts to get sent home. In the context of that film, Yossarian learned, he was, flying bomber. He was a bomber pilot, and the rule was if you flew a certain number of missions, you would be rotated back to the United States. He was based in North Africa, bombings, Italy, I think. And every time he would get close to that number, the base commander would increase the number of missions you had to fly before you could go back home. And he's getting worried because he's seeing people die all around him. And he tells a doctor he has to see, the base doctor, about that. They said, well, there's a way you can get sent back home. Well, what's that? Well, if you are insane, we have to send you back home. He said, okay, I'm insane then. How do I prove I'm insane? He said, well, you say you want to go back you want to get away from this war? Yes. Well, that proves you're not insane. So if you want to get out of it because you're insane, because you're afraid, that shows you are not insane. It's a normal reaction. It's a catch-22. There's no way out. It's a no-win situation. Peter Principle. Employees tend to rise to their level of incompetence. This was a popular book published in 1969. The idea is, and this applies to those organizations which were common, where you could stay your whole life in that job, in that career. And you're good at something, you're promoted to something else. You're good at that. They say, wow, good job. We need you at some more complex thing. Eventually you arrive at something you're not very good at, and that's where you stay. So you are the person in charge of doing something you're not good at. Not very rational. Parkinson's law from 55, if something can go wrong, it will. Also began to talk about the bureaucratic personality. Some people would get so hung up with all the rules and making sure they were followed to a T and everything was documented just right, etc. They forgot the purpose of the organization. We have a few of those at HCC, I believe. Other kinds of organizations, other categories. There are all these rules about how the organization is supposed to work. There's a mission statement that's very high-minded, and it's a lot of highlights all of the good values the corporation holds. It may be contradicted by what actually goes on. So informal organization refers to how the organization actually is working. For instance, you might take a shortcut to help somebody out. You know, you're supposed to transfer this complainant to a supervisor to deal with the power to do something, but you know how to get something done to give them a credit on their bill. So even though the rule says you transfer them, you just go ahead and do it just to be done with it. Okay, that's one example. Gendered organizations are those where your career depends upon your gender. If you are a man, you're going to be promoted faster and further than if you're a woman. There are still many gendered organizations. Probably most of them are. So this is where the term glass ceiling applies. Women can only rise so far. You don't find them in the upper reaches of management. There are exceptions. Glass escalators, this refers to promotions. Yes, you're a woman and you may be moving up, but you look over and there's another escalator that's moving faster. The men are on that one. Then there's a glass cliff. It's been noted that it's not uncommon that if a company is in trouble financially, that's when they may appoint a woman to be in charge, to take the fall, so to speak, to take the blame for the collapse of the company. Then we have deviant organizations that very efficiently accomplish things that are illegal or immoral or downright evil. An example, the Nazi Party in Germany, they very efficiently murdered 6 million Jews, 5 million non-Jews in camps, in ditches, in the Soviet Union, in wherever really, but the most efficient and organized were, of course, in the camps, the death camps, where they took, inventory of all your belongings. They interviewed you to find out what your skills were, if any, evaluated your health before deciding whether or not to have you killed immediately or work you to death. Nazi Germany bought an early form of computer. It was really just a punch card system for keeping records that could be retrieved rapidly from IBM, an American corporation. The heads of IBM were made aware that it appeared that the Germans were using this to facilitate mass murder. But the heads of IBM said, well, it's just business. So they moved on. I talked about another deviant organization that has been very efficient, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Those are deviant organizations. Manuel Castells introduced a concept called informationalism in his many writings on what he calls the information society. That is how he views contemporary society. That's his shorthand for that. If you're interested in very extensively developed social theory about the present moment and how things are going, you could do worse than to read his 3-volume book on the information society. My copies all look more or less like this. Volume 1, The Rise of the Network Society, followed by The Power of Identity and the End of Millennium. But he introduced the concept of informationalism, which is the application of information technology to the production, distribution, and now even consumption of goods and services. That's using GPS devices, GPS communicators, and assigning them to everyone that works in an Amazon warehouse filling orders, so you know where they are and you can send them little text messages. It applies in Walmart, where you stock shelves based upon a computer printout, and you determine exactly where they go and how many need to be there, because they've been keeping track. They know how many they have in stock, they know how many they've sold, so they know how many need to be taken out to the shelves, because these scanners at the checkout tell them what's being sold. When goods are received, they scan them in, and Walmart has a very extensive mechanism of control over all of its suppliers worldwide. So controlling the employees is just one aspect of it. Few companies are as controlling of their employees as Amazon, though. I'm not going to go into detail about all that. If you're interested, read a book called, I believe it's Mindless, how high technology, how smart technology is making humans dumber. At least I believe that's the title. It's going to focus on Amazon and Walmart. It's said that Amazon, even at the corporate level, it's rather cutthroat at Amazon. An article I read from one of the Amazon employees that had left the corporate offices in Seattle said that Amazon is where overachievers go to feel bad about themselves. Amazon introduced a way of rating your coworkers. You could make anonymous reports about your coworkers to management, and there were a lot of managers would simply do their annual evaluations simply by cutting and pasting what other workers had said about you. Well, if people didn't like you, they felt you weren't friendly enough or didn't fit in, they could take it upon themselves to engineer your departure, even though they had no power to fire you, through the use of this sort of a system. I think it was called anytime feedback system. So you also see a lot of network organizations that are organized. They're not this vertical thing where power flows up, but it's more horizontal. You have relationships with contractors that get things done. Society, that includes all these types. As I may have mentioned early on, George Ritzer defined it as a complex pattern of social relationships that are bounded in space and persist over time. I like that definition. It's very abstract. I don't know what could fall outside of it that we would think of as society. For a while, people talked a lot about risk society. Ulrich Beck said that society, concerns had shifted socially and politically from concerns about the distribution of goods to the distribution of risk. So safety had become more important than equality. And what held us together, we were all struggling to avoid danger from other avenues. And that is it. So don't rely on these definitions here at the end, but you might read through them. I hope this has been informative. I believe it gave you everything. All this is in the PDF. You have the study guide, so I suggest you take the study guide. If you can print it, do so. Write out answers by going through the PDF. You will do fine on the exam if you do that. So, on that note, that is the end of the first half of the lectures for this class. Bye.